Hi, I'm Rebecca Thompson, and I'm 26 years old. Last Christmas, I was sitting at our family dinner table, surrounded by twinkling lights and the smell of honey-glazed ham, when my brother Marcus looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Time to move out." The words hit me like a slap across the face. I had no idea that this Christmas dinner would change everything, not just for me, but for our entire family dynamic forever. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you'll want to see how this Christmas dinner ended. To understand why Marcus's words cut so deep, you need to know our family history. My father, Robert Thompson, is 67 years old and spent 40 years as a mechanic before retiring. He's always been the quiet type, preferring to fix things with his hands rather than talk through problems. My mother, Linda Thompson, is 64 and worked as an elementary school teacher until her retirement 5 years ago. She's naturally a peacekeeper, always trying to smooth over conflicts before they escalate. Marcus is my older brother. He's 30 years old and works in sales for a local car dealership. Growing up, he always carried this sense of entitlement, like the world owed him something just for existing. I'm the youngest at 26, and I'll be honest, I've always been Daddy's little girl. Maybe that's where some of Marcus's resentment started. 8 months before this Christmas dinner, my life had completely fallen apart. I'd ended a 4-year relationship with Jake Morrison when I discovered he'd been cheating on me with his coworker. The betrayal devastated me, but losing Jake wasn't even the worst part. 2 weeks after our breakup, the marketing firm where I'd worked for 3 years laid off half their staff due to budget cuts. Suddenly, I found myself heartbroken, unemployed, and facing an apartment lease I couldn't afford alone. That's when Mom and Dad stepped in. Without hesitation, they welcomed me back into my childhood home. "Honey, you take all the time you need to get back on your feet," Mom had said, hugging me tight as I cried into her shoulder. Dad had simply squeezed my hand and said, "This house will always be your home." I wasn't freeloading, despite what Marcus would later claim. I contributed to groceries, helped with household chores, and paid what I could toward utilities. I was actively job hunting, going on interviews, and slowly rebuilding my life. My parents never made me feel like a burden. In fact, they seemed to enjoy having me around again. We'd watch old movies together, and Mom would make my favorite chocolate chip cookies, just like when I was little. Marcus, on the other hand, was struggling financially. He'd married Sarah 3 years earlier, and they had 2 young children. They were living paycheck to paycheck, constantly stressed about money. Sarah worked part-time at a daycare, but most of her income went to childcare expenses. Childcare for their own kids. Recently, Marcus had started making snide comments about me taking advantage of our parents' generosity, but I tried to brush it off as stress talking. This particular Christmas felt different from the moment Marcus walked through the door. Usually, he'd greet everyone with forced cheerfulness, but today he seemed focused, almost businesslike. Sarah looked uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with me and focusing entirely on getting their kids settled. The house looked beautiful that day. Mom had outdone herself with decorations, twinkling lights wrapped around the staircase banister, garland draped over the mantel above the fireplace, and family photos from decades past smiled down at us from every surface. The dining room table was set with Mom's good china, the red tablecloth she only used for special occasions, and crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier overhead. We'd prepared all the traditional dishes. Dad had spent the morning preparing his famous honey-glazed ham, while Mom and I worked on mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and her legendary apple stuffing. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and sage, and Christmas music played softly from the old radio on the counter. Everything should have been perfect, but even during dinner preparation, I'd noticed Marcus making odd comments. When I'd reached for the good serving spoons, he'd muttered something about making myself right at home. When Dad complimented the potatoes I'd made, Marcus had rolled his eyes and said, "Well, she's had plenty of practice cooking here lately." Each comment felt like a small needle prick, but I tried to focus on the joy of being with family. As we sat down to eat, Marcus insisted on saying grace, which was unusual since Dad typically handled that honor. His prayer felt pointed, thanking God for family who support each other through temporary difficulties and asking for wisdom in knowing when help becomes enabling. Even with my eyes closed, I could feel the tension building in the room like storm, clouds gathering overhead. The uncomfortable comments started almost immediately after we began eating. Marcus had barely taken 3 bites of ham when he set down his fork and looked directly at me. "Rebecca, you've been here quite a while now, haven't you?" His tone was conversational, but there was something underneath it that made my stomach tighten. "About 8 months," I replied, carefully cutting my green beans into smaller pieces to give my hands something to do. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just curious. Time has a way of flying by, doesn't it?" He took a sip of wine and continued. "Some people need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet, you know. Independence is important for personal growth." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks flushing pink. "Marcus, honey, maybe we could talk about something else? The kids are excited about their new toys." She was clearly trying to redirect the conversation, but Marcus ignored her completely. Dad cleared his throat. His voice carrying a warning tone, "Marcus, it's Christmas. Let's just enjoy our dinner together as a family." He reached for the bowl of stuffing, his movements deliberate and controlled. I could see the muscle in his jaw twitching, a sure sign he was getting irritated. Mom let out a nervous laugh that sounded forced even to my ears. "More potatoes, anyone? Rebecca made them, and they're absolutely delicious." She was doing what she always did, trying to smooth over conflict with food and forced cheerfulness. But Marcus wasn't deterred. If anything, the gentle pushback seemed to encourage him. "I'm just saying, Mom and Dad have worked hard their whole lives. They deserve to enjoy their retirement without extra financial burdens." He emphasized the word burdens just enough to make it clear he was talking about me. The word stung because there was a grain of truth in it. I was contributing what I could, but I knew my presence meant higher utility bills, more groceries, and general wear and tear on the house. I'd been trying to find full-time work, but the job market was competitive, and I was being selective about positions that would actually advance my career rather than just pay bills. "I pay my share of expenses," I said quietly, surprised by how defensive I sounded. "And I help around the house. This isn't a one-sided arrangement." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your share, Rebecca? You're living in a 4-bedroom house with a 2-car garage and a finished basement. What exactly do you think your share should be?" The Christmas music that had been playing softly in the background suddenly felt irritating rather than festive. Bing Crosby was crooning about dreaming of a white Christmas while my brother was systematically destroying the peace of our family gathering. I found myself focusing on the lyrics, trying to escape the growing tension at the table. "Marcus, that's enough," Dad said firmly, setting down his fork with more force than necessary. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion." "When is the right time, Dad?" Marcus shot back. "When Rebecca's 40 and still living in her childhood bedroom. When you and Mom are in your 70s and still supporting a grown daughter who refuses to take responsibility for her own life." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "That's not fair, Marcus. I'm actively looking for work. I've had 3 interviews this month alone." "Interviews?" he scoffed. "How many job offers? How many times have you turned down positions because they weren't perfect for what you wanted?" "You're being picky while Mom and Dad foot the bill for your pickiness." Sarah reached over and placed her hand on Marcus's arm. "Honey, please. The children are getting upset." Indeed, their 6-year-old daughter Emma was looking back and forth between the adults with wide, frightened eyes, while 4-year-old Tommy had stopped eating entirely and was clutching his napkin like a security blanket. "But Marcus..." He shook off his wife's touch. "The children need to understand how the real world works, Sarah. They need to see that actions have consequences and that family isn't a safety net you can fall back on indefinitely." Mom's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "Rebecca is always welcome in our home. She's our daughter, and she's going through a difficult time." "A difficult time that's lasted 8 months and shows no signs of ending," Marcus replied, sharply. Meanwhile, Sarah and I are crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 kids and another one on the way, struggling to make ends meet while Rebecca lives here rent-free. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Another baby on the way. That explained Sarah's recent weight gain and why she'd been declining wine at family gatherings. It also explained the desperation I was hearing in Marcus's voice. They needed money, space, and help, and somehow I'd become the obstacle to them getting it. "Congratulations," I managed to say to Sarah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "I didn't know you were expecting again." "We wanted to announce it today," she said softly, not meeting my eyes. "But this isn't how we planned to tell everyone." The dinner that had started with such promise was rapidly deteriorating into something ugly and painful. The food on my plate had grown cold, and my appetite had completely disappeared. I could feel the walls of my childhood home closing in around me, the familiar space suddenly feeling foreign and unwelcoming. Marcus seemed to interpret the moment of silence as an opportunity to press his advantage. He pushed his plate away slightly and leaned forward, his elbows on the table in a posture that suggested he was settling in for a serious conversation. "Since we're all here together as a family, I think we need to address the elephant in the room." "What elephant would that be?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My heart was beating faster, and I could feel that familiar fight or flight response kicking in. Part of me wanted to excuse myself from the table, but I knew that running away would only prove whatever point Marcus was trying to make. "Your living situation, Rebecca. We need to talk about your living situation and how it's affecting this family." His voice had taken on the same tone he used when selling cars, confident and persistent. "You can't just live here indefinitely, rent-free while the rest of us struggle to make ends meet in the real world." I tried to keep my voice steady, professional even. "Marcus, I understand you're under financial pressure with the new baby coming, but I'm not living here rent-free. I contribute to household expenses, I help with maintenance and cleaning, and I'm actively looking for full-time employment. This isn't permanent, and it's not taking anything away from you. Isn't it?" He leaned back in his chair, and I caught a glimpse of the smug expression that used to infuriate me when we were children. "Mom and Dad have limited resources. Every dollar they spend supporting you is a dollar they can't use to help their grandchildren or save for their own future needs." Dad set down his water glass with enough force to make the ice cubes clink against the sides. "Marcus, that's enough. This isn't the time or place for this discussion, and frankly, it's none of your business how your mother and I choose to help our children." "But it is my business, Dad," Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly. "It's my business because you two are too soft-hearted to set appropriate boundaries, and Rebecca is taking advantage of that kindness." Mom's voice was shaking when she spoke. "Rebecca is not taking advantage of anyone. She's our daughter, and she's always welcome in our home. I don't want to hear another word about this." Marcus turned to look directly at our mother, his expression softening just enough to seem reasonable. "Mom, I love Rebecca too. We all do. But love sometimes means tough love. Love means helping someone become independent and self-sufficient, not enabling them to avoid responsibility." The word enabling hit me like a slap. It suggested that my parents were somehow harming me by providing support during a difficult time, that their love and assistance were actually making me weaker. I'd heard this argument before from Jake during our relationship. Whenever I'd asked for emotional support during stressful periods, the familiar rhetoric made my skin crawl. "I don't need to be enabled, Marcus, because I'm not an addict or a child," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "I'm an adult who lost her job and ended a long-term relationship within the same month. I'm rebuilding my life, and I'm grateful to have family who understands that sometimes rebuilding takes time. 8 months, Rebecca. 8 months is not rebuilding. It's settling. It's getting comfortable with having other people solve your problems while you figure out what you want to do with your life." He gestured around the dining room with its family photos and holiday decorations. "This isn't your apartment. This isn't your house. This is Mom and Dad's home, and you're 30 years old living like a teenager." "I'm 26, I corrected automatically, then immediately felt stupid for focusing on such a minor detail when he was attacking my entire character. 26, 30, what's the difference? You're a grown woman who should have her own place, her own life, her own responsibilities. Instead, you're hiding out in your childhood bedroom while mom does your laundry and dad pays your car insurance. I do my own laundry, I protested. But even as the words left my mouth, I realized how petty they sounded. Marcus was painting a picture of me as a spoiled, dependent child, and my defensive responses were only reinforcing that image. Sarah had been trying to keep their children distracted during the increasingly heated exchange, but Emma, their 6-year-old, suddenly spoke up. Why is Uncle Marcus yelling at Aunt Rebecca? Is Aunt Rebecca in trouble? The innocent question from a child cut through the adult tension. Tension hung like a knife. Here we were, supposedly celebrating the birth of Christ and the joy of family, togetherness, and instead we were having a public argument about money and responsibility in front of children who just wanted to enjoy Christmas dinner. Nobody's in trouble, sweetheart, Sarah said quickly, shooting Marcus a meaningful look. The grown-ups are just having a discussion. But Marcus seemed energized rather than chastened by his daughter's question. Actually, Emma, this is a good learning opportunity. Sometimes adults have to make hard decisions about what's best for everyone in the family, even when those decisions are difficult. I couldn't believe he was using his own child to justify his attack on me. Marcus, please. Don't involve Emma in this. She doesn't need to hear adult family problems. Why not? She's going to grow up in this family, and she needs to understand how responsibility works. She needs to see that when you're an adult, you take care of yourself. You don't expect other people to take care of you indefinitely. Dad stood up from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. That's it, Marcus. I want you to stop this right now. You're ruining Christmas dinner, you're upsetting the children, and you're being cruel to your sister for no good reason. For no good reason? Marcus stood up as well, and suddenly the dining room felt much smaller with 2 angry men facing off across the holiday table. Dad, I'm trying to help this family face reality. Rebecca has been here for 8 months with no end date, no plan, and no accountability. Meanwhile, Sarah and I are about to have 3 children in a 2-bedroom apartment, and we can't even afford to move because every spare dollar goes to supporting ourselves. Then maybe you should have thought about that before getting pregnant. Again, I snapped, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left my mouth. It was a low blow, and I knew it, but Marcus's constant attacks were wearing down my self-control. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went white, and she looked like she'd been physically struck. Marcus's eyes blazed with fury, and I could see Dad's disappointed expression in my peripheral vision. I'd crossed a line, said something cruel and unforgivable, and there was no taking it back. I'm sorry, I said quickly, looking directly at Sarah. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean that. Congratulations on your pregnancy. I'm upset and I said something horrible. But Marcus wasn't interested in my apology. No, Rebecca, don't apologize. Let everyone see who you really are when you're backed into a corner. Let them see how selfish and nasty you get when someone suggests you might need to take responsibility for your own life. Marcus walked around the table until he was standing directly behind Dad's chair, placing his hands on our father's shoulders in a gesture that looked supportive but felt manipulative. Mom, Dad, I think it's time we set some firm boundaries here. This situation has gone on long enough, and it's not healthy for anyone involved. I watched in horrified fascination as my brother positioned himself as the voice of reason while simultaneously undermining my place in the family. He was good at this, I had to admit. Years of sales training had taught him how to control a conversation and guide people toward the conclusion he wanted them to reach. What kind of boundaries are you talking about, son? Dad asked, his voice carefully neutral. I could see him trying to navigate between supporting me and maintaining peace with Marcus, and my heart ached for the impossible position my brother was putting him in. Marcus straightened up and looked directly at me across the table. His expression had shifted from angry to coldly determined, and I realized with growing dread that this entire confrontation had been planned. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst triggered by holiday stress. This was a calculated intervention designed to force me out of the house. Rebecca, he said, his voice taking on that same authoritative tone he'd used when we were children, and he was trying to get me in trouble with our parents. You have 1 week to find somewhere else to live. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Mom gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest. Dad's mouth fell open in shock. Sarah looked mortified, clearly not knowing this was how Marcus planned to handle the situation. Even the children sensed the gravity of the moment and fell completely silent. But it was Marcus's expression that truly devastated me as he delivered his ultimatum. A slow, satisfied smirk spread across his face. It was the same look he'd worn when we were kids, and he'd successfully gotten me punished for something I hadn't done, or when he'd broken one of my toys and convinced our parents it was an accident. It was the look of someone who knew they'd won and was savoring their victory. "I've already looked into some apartments for you," he continued, his voice dripping with false helpfulness. "There are some nice places downtown that you can afford, if you get a roommate. Nothing fancy, but they're clean and safe, perfect for someone just starting out on their own." The condescension in his tone was breathtaking. He was talking to me like I was a recent college graduate rather than a 26-year-old woman who'd been living independently for years before my recent setbacks. The fact that he'd already been apartment hunting on my behalf showed just how much thought he'd put into this ambush. 1 week, he repeated, crossing his arms over his chest and looking incredibly pleased with himself. That's generous, considering most landlords give 30 days notice, but I figure families should get a little extra consideration. I looked desperately at my parents, hoping they would immediately shut down Marcus's presumptuous ultimatum, but instead, I was met with stunned silence. Dad's fork was suspended halfway to his mouth, forgotten in his shock. Mom's eyes were wide and darting between Marcus and me as if she couldn't quite process what was happening. Their silence cut deeper than Marcus's words. In that moment, their failure to immediately defend me felt like abandonment. I understood they were processing that Marcus had blindsided them just as much as he blindsided me, but their hesitation felt like permission for him to continue his attack. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking, and I felt like that helpless little girl again, standing in the principal's office while Marcus spun some elaborate lie that would get him out of trouble and me into it. The familiar family dynamics were reasserting themselves, with terrifying clarity. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't your decision to make, isn't it?" He uncrossed his arms and placed his palms flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Someone has to make the hard decisions around here, Rebecca. Someone has to be the adult in the room and say what everyone else is thinking but is too polite to say out loud. What everyone else is thinking, I repeated, looking again at my parents. Is that true? Is this what you both want? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I was forcing my parents to choose sides, which I hated doing, but Marcus had backed me into a corner where there were no good options left. Either they supported his ultimatum or they stood up to him and defended my right to stay. Dad finally set down his fork and cleared his throat. Marcus, son, this is our decision to make, not yours. Rebecca is our daughter, and decisions about our household are between your mother, myself, and Rebecca. Relief flooded through me at Dad's words, but it was short-lived. Marcus wasn't deterred, in the slightest, by the gentle rebuke. If anything, he seemed to have expected it and prepared a counter-argument. Of course it's your decision, Dad. I'm not trying to overstep. I'm just pointing out what everyone can see but nobody wants to acknowledge. This arrangement isn't working for anyone. Rebecca isn't growing or moving forward with her life. You and Mom are under financial strain you won't admit to. And meanwhile, your grandchildren are living in cramped conditions while resources get diverted to enabling someone who should be standing on her own feet. Mom finally found her voice, though it sounded shaky and uncertain. Rebecca, honey, we need to talk about this as a family. Maybe we should sit down after dinner and discuss everyone's concerns. But Marcus shook his head firmly. No, Mom. We've been tiptoeing around this issue for months while it gets worse, not better. Rebecca needs a firm deadline, or she'll just keep making excuses and putting off the inevitable. 1 week is reasonable. It gives her time to make arrangements without dragging this out indefinitely. I stood up from the table abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. The fight-or-flight response had finally tipped toward flight, and I needed to get away from Marcus's smug face and my parents' uncertain expressions. I needed space to think, to process what was happening, to figure out how to respond to this coordinated attack on my place in the family. "Sit down," Marcus said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of an older brother who was used to being obeyed. "We're not done here. You don't get to just walk away when we're having an important family discussion." The command in his voice made me freeze halfway to a standing position. For a split second, I almost obeyed him automatically, the way I had when we were children. But then I realized what was happening. Marcus was treating me like a child because it served his purpose. He was using his position as the older sibling to establish dominance in a situation where he actually had no authority at all. "1 week, Rebecca," he said again, his voice softer now but no less determined. "That's generous under the circumstances. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As I stood there frozen between sitting and leaving, a memory suddenly surfaced. With startling clarity, I was 18 years old, sitting in Grandma Eleanor's living room just 3 months before she passed away. She'd called me over for what she said was an important conversation, but I'd been distracted, eager to get back to my friends and my senior year activities. "The house papers are in the safe, sweetheart," she'd said, pressing a small piece of paper with numbers into my hand. "Your grandfather and I wanted you to have security. We never told your parents about the transfer because we wanted you to decide when the time was right. At 18, I barely listened. The idea of needing security had seemed absurd when I was young and convinced I could conquer the world. I tucked the paper away and forgot about it, focused on college applications and prom planning. But now, standing in this dining room while my brother systematically dismantled my place in the family, those words came rushing back with devastating clarity. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to get something from upstairs." Marcus looked annoyed at the interruption. "Rebecca, we're in the middle of a family meeting. Whatever you need can wait until we're finished discussing your living arrangements." "Actually, it can't wait," I replied, already moving toward the staircase. "It's directly relevant to this conversation." I climbed the stairs on shaking legs, my mind racing as puzzle pieces began clicking into place. Grandma Eleanor had always been protective of me, especially after Grandpa died when I was 16. She'd worried about my future, about making sure I always had a safe place to land if life knocked me down. At the time, her concerns had seemed overly cautious, even pessimistic. Now they felt prophetic. The safe was in my parents' bedroom closet, hidden behind a row of Dad's old work shirts. I knelt in front of it and tried the combination Grandma had given me all those years ago, her birthday 10/23/38. The lock clicked open on the first try. My parents' important documents and some of Mom's jewelry. I found a manila envelope with my name written in Grandma's careful handwriting. My hands were trembling as I opened it and pulled out the official property deed dated 15 years ago. The legal language was dense and formal, but the essential facts were clear. Eleanor Margaret Thompson and William Charles Thompson had transferred ownership of the property at 1247 Maple Avenue to Rebecca Eleanor Thompson on her 18th birthday. The house I'd grown up in, the house I was being ordered to leave, legally belonged to me. As I read through the document, more details came flooding back. Grandma and Grandpa had bought this house in 1968 when Dad was just starting his apprenticeship at the garage. They'd lived here for almost 20 years before deciding to move to the smaller condo across town to be closer to medical facilities as they aged. Instead of selling the house or simply giving it to my parents, they'd held on to the deed. "We want to make sure Rebecca always has a home," Grandma had explained to my confused 18-year-old self. "Your parents are wonderful people, but they're too generous for their own good sometimes. If something happens to them or if she ever needs a safe place, we want her to have options." The arrangement had been that my parents would live in the house as caretakers, paying the property taxes and maintaining the building while technically I was the owner. Grandma had made them promise not to tell Marcus about the arrangement unless it became necessary, knowing his tendency toward jealousy and entitlement. I sat back on my heels in my parents' closet, holding the deed and trying to process the magnitude of what I had just discovered. For 8 years, I'd been living in my own house without knowing it. My parents had been so focused on caring for Grandma during her final illness, and grieving her death afterward that the property transfer had gotten lost in their memories. Downstairs, I could hear Marcus's voice carrying through the house as he continued his prosecution of my character. The irony was almost unbearable. He was ordering me out of my own home while positioning himself as the voice of financial responsibility and family authority. With the deed clutched in my hand, I walked back down the stairs slowly, each step feeling momentous. The family portrait gallery along the stairway wall seemed to take on new meaning. These weren't just family memories anymore. There were pictures taken in my house, celebrating holidays in my dining room, opening Christmas presents in my living room. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I could hear Marcus saying, "Maybe we should have done this intervention sooner." Sometimes families enable destructive behavior by avoiding difficult conversations. I paused at the entrance to the dining room, taking in the scene before me. Marcus was still standing in his position of authority behind Dad's chair, his posture confident and commanding. Sarah was looking incredulous. Acingly uncomfortable, clearly wishing she was anywhere else, Mom and Dad appeared aged by the stress of the confrontation, their faces drawn and worried. The children had been quietly moved to the living room with their tablets, but I could see them glancing nervously toward the dining room where the adults were having their important discussion. The Christmas tree lights twinkled behind them, and wrapped presents sat waiting to be opened, but the holiday joy had been completely sucked out of the day. "Rebecca," Marcus said as I entered the room, "I'm glad you're back. We've been discussing some practical next steps for your transition to independent living. Sarah found a few apartment listings online that might work for your budget." I walked calmly to my seat at the table and placed the property deed next to Marcus's plate, right beside his barely touched slice of apple pie. The official document looked starkly formal against Mom's festive red tablecloth, but its presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. "Actually, Marcus," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I have some news about moving out that I think everyone should hear." Marcus glanced down at the document with casual disinterest, then did a double-take as his brain processed what he was seeing. His confident expression faltered as he picked up the deed and began reading the legal text. "What? What is this?" he asked, his voice losing its authoritative tone for the first time all evening. "That's the property deed to this house," I replied calmly. "It shows that Grandma and Grandpa transferred ownership to me 8 years ago when I turned 18. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's face drained of color as he read through the document more carefully. Mom and Dad were staring at me with expressions of dawning recognition, their memories clearly being jarred back to conversations they'd had with Grandma years earlier. "This can't be real," Marcus said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. He was still staring at the official stamps and signatures that made the document legally binding. "It's very real," I said. "And Marcus, about that 1-week deadline you gave me." Marcus was turning the deed over in his hands as if hoping the back would contain different information than the front. His competent demeanor had evaporated, completely replaced by the desperate expression of someone watching their carefully constructed plan crumble in real time. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "Did you know about this? Did you know Rebecca owned the house this whole time?" Dad rubbed his forehead with both hands, looking suddenly exhausted. "We knew Eleanor and William had made arrangements, but honestly, Marcus, with everything that happened during Eleanor's final illness and then the funeral, we just forgot about the specifics. We've been so focused on taking care of the property and maintaining everything that the legal ownership details got pushed to the back of our minds." Mom nodded. Slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and embarrassment, Eleanor made us promise to let Rebecca decide when to tell the family about the arrangement. She said Rebecca should have control over when and how to use that information. "You let me embarrass myself," Marcus exploded, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "You sat there and watched me lecture Rebecca about responsibility and independence, and the whole time she owns the house. How could you not tell me?" "Because it wasn't your business," I said quietly but firmly. "Honestly, Marcus, I never wanted to use this information. I hoped we could all live together as a family, supporting each other through difficult times. I hoped I'd never need to pull rank or assert legal ownership. I wanted us to be a family, not landlord and tenants." Sarah had been sitting in stunned silence, but now she spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, honey, we need to apologize. This whole thing, we've handled this all wrong. But Marcus wasn't ready to accept responsibility for his behavior. This is manipulation. Rebecca, you deliberately hid this information to make me look like the bad guy. You could have told me months ago that you owned the house, but instead you let me think you were freeloading off our parents. I wasn't hiding anything to manipulate you, I replied, surprised by how calm I felt now that the truth was out. I was trying to be a family member, not a property owner. I was hoping we could work together, support each other, and treat this house as a family home rather than a piece of real estate with complicated ownership issues. Dad leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. Marcus, son, you owe your sister an apology. Rebecca has been nothing but generous and kind throughout this entire arrangement. She's contributed financially, helped around the house, and never once made any of us feel like tenants in her property. And she certainly didn't deserve the cruel way you spoke to her tonight, Mom added, her voice carrying a steeliness I rarely heard from her. I raised you better than that, Marcus Thompson. The way you attacked your sister at Christmas dinner was shameful. Marcus looked around the table desperately, as if searching for an ally who might help him salvage some dignity from the situation. Finding none, he tried a different approach. Look, I'm sorry if I came across too harshly, but my point about independence still stands. Just because Rebecca owns the house doesn't mean it's healthy for her to avoid building her own life. But that's not your decision to make, I said firmly. It never was your decision to make, Marcus. Whether I stay here for 8 more months or 8 more years, that's between me, Mom, and Dad. You don't get to set ultimatums about my living arrangements. In my own house. The word my hung in the air with new weight. For the first time since I'd moved back home, I was asserting ownership, not just of the property, but of my right to make decisions about my own life. Life without interference from my judgmental, older brother. Since you seem so concerned about firm boundaries and clear timelines, let me establish some. You all have 24 hours to decide whether you want to continue living here under the previous arrangement, or whether you'd prefer to make other living arrangements. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. You can't be serious. You're going to kick out Mom and Dad because I hurt your feelings? I'm not kicking out anyone, Marcus. Mom and Dad are welcome to stay here as long as they want. This is their home, and I love having them here. But you, I paused, looking directly at my brother, you need to decide whether you can treat me with basic respect and courtesy, or whether you'd prefer to continue your attacks on my character somewhere else. Sarah suddenly stood up from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. Kids, get your coats. We're leaving. Her voice was tight with embarrassment and anger, though I couldn't tell if the anger was directed at Marcus or at the situation in general. Sarah, wait, Marcus said, reaching for his wife's arm. We don't have to leave. This is still a family discussion. No, Marcus. This stopped being a family discussion the moment you decided to humiliate your sister in front of our children. Sarah's voice was shaking with emotion. I've been sitting here watching you tear apart someone who's been nothing but kind to our family, and I'm ashamed of you. We're going home. Marcus looked around the table one more time, his expression cycling through anger, embarrassment, and finally defeat. This isn't over, Rebecca. We still need to have a real conversation about family dynamics and responsibilities. You're absolutely right, I agreed. But the next time we have that conversation, it's going to be on equal terms, with mutual respect and without ultimatums or threats. When you're ready to treat me like an adult family member, instead of a problem to be solved, let me know. As Marcus gathered his family's belongings and herded his confused children toward the door, Dad finally spoke up. Son, I think you should take some time to think about what happened here tonight. Rebecca has been generous and patient with all of us, and she deserved better than what you gave her today. After Marcus and his family left, the house felt simultaneously empty and peaceful. The 3 of us who remained sat in silence for several minutes, processing the emotional whiplash of the evening's events. Rebecca, Mom said finally, I'm so sorry we didn't remember the property situation sooner. If we had, maybe this whole confrontation could have been avoided. Maybe, I agreed, but honestly, I'm glad it happened this way. Marcus needed to show his true colors, and I needed to learn to stand up for myself. If I had just pulled out the deed at the beginning of his speech, he would have found some way to make himself the victim. Dad nodded thoughtfully. Your grandmother was wise to give you that security, sweetheart. She always worried about you being too trusting, too willing to let other people make decisions for you. I think she'd be proud of how you handled yourself. Tonight. The first week after Christmas was strange and quiet. Marcus sent several angry text messages demanding to know if I was really going to destroy the family over a property deed, but I didn't respond. I needed time to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward without repeating the same dysfunctional patterns that had allowed the situation to develop in the first place. Mom and Dad were processing too, having their own quiet conversations about boundaries and family dynamics. I overheard Dad on the phone with his brother saying, I think we've been so focused on keeping peace that we forgot to teach our son how to treat people with respect. After New Year's, I suggested family therapy. The idea made everyone uncomfortable. Initially, but I insisted that if we were going to rebuild our relationships, we needed professional help to navigate the complicated emotions and resentments that Christmas dinner had brought to the surface. Our first session was awkward and painful. Marcus came reluctantly, clearly still angry about being ambushed with the property deed. But as the weeks progressed, some truths began emerging. Marcus admitted that he'd been jealous of my relationship with our parents for years, feeling like the responsible child who got taken for granted while I got all the attention and support. I learned to acknowledge that while his feelings were valid, his methods of expressing them were completely unacceptable. The therapist helped us understand that families can support multiple adult children in different ways without anyone being diminished by someone else's success or security. The most difficult realization was that I had been using my parents' home as a safe space to avoid fully engaging with the challenging work of rebuilding my life. While Marcus's accusations were cruel and his approach was wrong, there was a kernel of truth in his concern that I was becoming too comfortable with dependence. By spring, I'd found a full-time position with a nonprofit organization that felt meaningful and sustainable. I also started dating someone new, a kind and emotionally mature man named David, who treated me as an equal partner rather than someone who needed to be fixed or managed. Marcus and I slowly began rebuilding our relationship, but it was different now. I no longer automatically deferred to his opinions or allowed his disapproval to influence my decisions. He had to learn to interact with me as an adult, rather than as his little sister who could be bullied into compliance. The most significant change was in how I viewed my own worth and security. Owning the house had given me legal protection, but learning to defend my place in it had given me something much more valuable: confidence in my right to exist without justifying myself to anyone. 6 months later, when Sarah gave birth to their third. As a child, I hosted a welcome party at the house. Marcus thanked me afterward, saying it meant a lot to have family support during such an important time. It was a small moment, but it felt like progress. A year after that infamous Christmas dinner, I was hosting holiday celebrations in my own home, surrounded by people who chose to be there because they enjoyed my company, not because they felt obligated by family ties. Mom and Dad had moved to a smaller apartment nearby, preferring the independence while staying close enough for frequent visits. The house, which had once felt like a refuge from the world, became a launching pad for the life I actually wanted to build. I'd learned that having a safety net didn't make me weak. It made me brave enough to take risks and pursue opportunities that felt aligned with my values. Looking back, I realized that my grandmother's greatest gift wasn't the property deed itself. It was the lesson that security comes from knowing your own worth, understanding your rights, and having the courage to defend both when necessary. Sometimes, the people who should protect you are the ones who hurt you most. Family relationships can be complicated by jealousy, competition, and unresolved childhood dynamics that have nothing to do with your actual character or behavior. Learning to recognize manipulation and respond to it with calm strength rather than defensive emotion is one of the most valuable skills anyone can develop. Having legal ownership of a house mattered less than learning to own my worth as a person, but sometimes life gives you exactly the tool you need to start standing up for yourself, even if you don't realize. You need it until someone tries to take away your sense of belonging. That Christmas dinner destroyed old patterns of family interaction that weren't serving anyone well. In their place, we built something healthier based on mutual respect, rather than automatic deference to age or gender roles. It wasn't easy, And it wasn't immediate, but it was necessary. The house was just walls and a roof, but learning to defend my place in it taught me what home really means. Home isn't about ownership, family obligations, or meeting other people's expectations of who you should be. Home is about surrounding yourself with people who see your worth and choosing to invest your energy in relationships that bring out the best in everyone involved. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who was trying to control your life? How did you find the courage to set boundaries with someone you love? Drop a comment below and share your story. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family boundaries and finding your voice. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they have the right to defend their place at the table, literally or figuratively. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you are worth defending. Your feelings are valid, and sometimes, the most important thing is to stand up for yourself. The most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to accept unacceptable behavior. Wishing you all peaceful holidays filled with genuine love and respect.